How you guys doing? This is Derek with Woodworking. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make these Craftsman Style or Mission Style doors. Throughout this video, if there's some equipment that you may not have, I'm going to be going over some alternatives that you probably do have or hopefully have. The main things that you're going to need are a table saw, miter saw, and a router. And then of course some other little things like hammer, glue, clamps, and a sander, which if you're already trying to get into woodworking, you probably already have some of those things. So of course, as you can see, this door is not painted. This is just raw wood with a panel. The next step in the process is going to be painting, but in this video, you're going to be finding out how we make these. So let's jump right into the first step of the process, which is going to be measuring our door size. When figuring out your door size, first you need to know what your overlay is going to be. So you're going to want to know what hinge you are going to use. Now both these hinges I have in my hand are both Blum hinges. I have another video that kind of talks about some of the hinges. This one right here is a newer style that I'm going to be reviewing. But this is a full overlay hinge, which full overlay means 1.5 inch overlay. Now our face frames are 1.75 inches wide. So the full overlay, 1.5 inch overlay, would cover almost the entire face frame, revealing only 1/4 inch right here on either side. Okay? Now the other hinge here is what we're going to be using on this kitchen. This is a 1/2 inch overlay. I call it a 1/2 inch overlay. It also has a plate on it, but this is actually called like a straight shank 110 degree hinge, something like that. I'll post links to these hinges in the description where I order them from. You can only get it if you have a business account, but I'll find somewhere else online. I know they sell these all over the place, so I'll try to figure out the part numbers to those sites, and I'll post them in the description. But regardless, what we're going to be using is this 1/2 inch overlay. So let's measure this up. I already have all these sizes already measured. So what I'm going to do is, for the sake of easy figuring, I'm going to just give you a measurement of this. So I'm going to measure from this inside to inside. Let's pretend like this is 29 1/8. All right, it's not, but for the sake of this, let's just pretend like inside to inside is 29 1/8. Since we're using 1/2 inch overlay, these are going to be 1/2 inch overlay on this side and 1/2 inch on this side. So let's take that 29 1/8. We're going to add 1 inch. Super easy figuring. So your inside plus 1 inch, since it's 1/2 inch on either side. So that's now 30 1/8. Now, this is going to be a double door here. Obviously, this is very wide. So they're going to meet in the middle, and the space in the middle is going to be 1/8. So we're going to take that 30 1/8. We're going to deduct 1/8. Now we're at 30. Divide by 2 doors. Each one's going to be 15 inches wide. So that's how I do it. I will post a formula, but the formula is really going to just be based off of what style hinge you're using, because it's going to depend on what your overlay is going to be. But whatever your overlay is, that's going to decide what your full width is. This up here is a drawer. Now, this is actually a sink base, so it's not actually going to be a drawer, but we do need to make a drawer front for it. So that's going to be the same width of your overall, which would be 30 1/8, because you want the doors to line up with the drawer front, or else it's not going to look right. Now, another important thing to take into account when you're figuring out your sizes and your overlays, if you do full overlay in an entire kitchen, there might be instances where you cannot use this hinge. For instance, if there was a wall here, this cabinet butted right up to a wall. If you use a full overlay hinge, you won't be able to swing that door open. So even when I'm doing a full overlay kitchen, there are specific areas where I will use a 1/2 inch overlay hinge. One of them being where it's up against a wall, where it meets, if this was a wall cabinet, that's a wall cabinet, but where a wall cabinet meets a deeper cabinet, because it's as if it's up against a wall, because you have something protruding where the door is going to be. Now, that's why it's important to print out. I have a printout of the kitchen. I have each cabinet labeled This is kind of, I've already done some scribbling on this, and there's a bunch of extra measurements because I send the measurements to a countertop guy to get a rough estimate on that. So there's a bunch of extra stuff on this, but regardless, this helps me visually see what things are butting up against, you know, and this will help me decide what needs to be what overlay. But since I'm doing 1/2 inch overlay, I don't need to worry because it's all gonna be 1/2 inch overlay. Now that is all the width. So this one here was 15, 2 doors, 15 inches wide. Now we have to figure out the height. Now since it is 1 3/4 rail, what I do is I measure down and I put a mark at 3/4 and 1 inch. Now that's gonna be 3/4 down and 3/4 up, as my tape goes crazy on me. So it's 3/4 for both sides. Now I leave this 1/4 inch in between the doors. Now what I like to do with this, before I actually measure, I'll explain it, is I do full overlay height. What that means is I'm gonna leave a 1/4 inch here that's not covered. Then we come down here and there's gonna be a 1/4 inch in between the doors. And then I'm gonna leave a 1/4 inch here, which you won't even be able to see because you're gonna be up high looking down. What that allows me to do is to make this drawer front a little wider so that I can make it like a door, make it a full Craftsman style door. So let's measure top all the way down to here. I have 7.5. Now remember, I'm gonna be coming down a 1/4 inch. So 7.5 minus a 1/4 is really easy, 7 1/4. Same thing measuring up. I have 22 1/4. Deduct that 1/4 down below here is gonna be 22. So that's gonna give me my height. This one's gonna be 15 wide by 22 high. This one's gonna be 30 1/8 by 7 1/4. Now, I know that kind of seems a little confusing. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I'm talking in circles. But regardless, that's gonna be the sizes there. Now, I do write it all down on a paper here that a door chart. I write what cabinet it is, and then I write how many doors, width, and then the height. And then I'll do drawers and shelves, accessories, stuff like that, so that I have all the sizes that we need for the cabinets. Also on drawer bases, it's the same general idea, obviously with the width. The height is gonna be the same thing too. So I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna put my marks. Like I said, I measure down and I do 3/4 and 1 inch, but I'm gonna do that on both these middle rails. Now that I have those marked, I can a little bit easier figure out the sizes because I want 1/4 inch to be exposed here, 1/4 inch exposed here, 1/4 inch on the bottom, 1/4 inch on the top, because it's gonna be 1/4 all the way around. And if this was full overlay, I would be 1/4 on both sides, but this is not. So measure down to this, 7.5. It's gonna be 7 1/4, which is the same as the sink base because all of those wrapped around the kitchen are the same. Now I'm gonna measure this one from here down, mark to mark is 10.5. Measuring this one up, I have 12.5, but gonna come up a 1/4, or sorry, 11.5, gonna come up a 1/4, and it's gonna be 11 1/4. Now I already really know these sizes because in our kitchens, these are all the same height, 7 1/4, 10.5, 11 1/4. And that's just based off our cabinet sizes and the openings and the drawer material we use for each one. Now, I didn't specify it before, but let me just go over if this was a full overlay unit. So if this was full overlay, we would be only showing 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch on this side. Now, the easiest way to figure this, as long as your rails are exactly 1 3/4, which is important, for the most part, you can measure this whole cabinet. Say this is 18 inches wide. You're going to deduct a 1/4 and a 1/4, which is 1/2 inch. So you would be making this 17.5 wide. That's one of the easiest ways to figure it. Just measure your outside to outside, deduct a half. That's going to be your measurement. Obviously, if you're doing doors that way, you need to deduct your 1/8 in the middle and then divide it by 2. But same general idea, but that really is critical when you're doing the doors because you want them to meet. This isn't critical. If I had 3/16 exposed here and 3/16 here, these are going to be screwed in from the drawer to the drawer front. So it's as long as they're all the same and it looks straight, that's not going to be critical. But the doors, if your door ends up being like a 1/16 or an 1/8 inch heavy, they're not going to want to meet in the middle. They're going to be a little bit big. Those hinges do have adjustments, but you might not be able to adjust it enough, which you will have issues later on. For the wall cabinet, it's going to be pretty much the same. Measure inside to inside, add that 1 inch, since it's going to be 1/2 inch on either side, add 1 inch, deduct the 1/8 in the middle, since it's going to be a double door, and divide by 2. That's going to be the same thing as this, but the height is a little bit different. All my cabinets go right up to the ceiling, and I cap the top with crown molding. So I only go up 1/2 inch here to give me some room for the crown molding. So I only go up 1/2 inch and I still come up 1/4 from the bottom. So that's going to be, I have 21.5. It's going to be 21.25. Again, that's 1/4 inch up from the bottom and 1/2 inch up from here, 21.25. So the next step in the process, which we'll jump to, is going to be figuring out the sizes of our pieces. Verticals are easy because that's just going to be what it's going to be. These 22, this 7.25, but the widths are a little bit different. So let's jump to that. This here is my sample piece. Now I have already ran it through the shaper and given it that groove. Now this piece also has that groove. Now when I'm going to measure this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to butt my tape measure into that groove. Now, if you think about it, step back and kind of think about it, that middle piece, that horizontal piece is going to be in this groove. If I put this here, it's going to be inside this groove to inside this groove. That's going to be my long point to long point. So that full piece needs to be that size. Now, you can, to get these pieces, what you're going to need to do is set up a router and do that. Make these sample pieces with a router. Now it's going to be a lot easier to do this if you have 2 routers and you can set them up, one with this, one with the tongue piece. It'd definitely be a lot easier if you did that. If not, you can still make it work. You're just going to be swapping the bits back and forth. So it is important though to measure to make sure that you have these pieces. Now what I'll cover when I start making the pieces, but these are 2 5/8 wide. That's what we always make our width of our pieces 99% of the time. I'll cover that in a minute as well, but our drawers are a little bit different. So let's get some measurements for this. Now, these pieces my horizontal piece tends to leave about a 1/16-ish on either side, so it's gonna range a little bit. But what I do, let's measure this up. So our fake pieces that I measured for that cabinet was going to be 15, our fake door. So I like to actually clamp this flat with the bench. It kind of gives me something like parallel to go off of. I don't want it to be cockeyed or anything like that. I sometimes do a corner, but I stick it out a little past just in case my tape measure catches the corner and not the door if it was in, because then it would give me a false measurement. So let's measure 15. I'm going to make sure that this piece is staying parallel with the bench. Let's go to 15. Okay, 15. Now, double check it. It is 15 on the dot. Now, I butt my tape measure on the inside of this, and then I read on the inside of this. So, I actually have 10 and 13/16. I'm going to make this 10 3/4, which is 1/16 less than it measured. That's about what these range. Now what you can do is you can kind of make a couple more sample pieces, put it together and find out If yours has a bigger gap, less of a gap, whatever your gap is, you can kind of figure out what your size is going to come to, and then you'll figure out how much you need to add or subtract. You might need to add a little bit there or make it exact to make it come out to that. So what mine is going to come to is 10 3/4. 10 3/4. That's with deducting the 16th. So what I said before is I was going to tell you a little bit about the drawer fronts. So drawer fronts, the way to make it, since we want to make it like a mission style panel using this type of rail instead of making it just a flat front, which, you know, some people might like. I think it looks a little plain. I'd rather it look like you know, Craftsman door. So in order to do that, we did the full overlay, so we gave ourselves a little more height. Then we make these rails on the top and bottom, the horizontal rails, 2 inches instead of 2 5/8. The sides are still going to be 2 5/8, but the top and bottom are going to be 2 inch. That gives us a little bit more room for that panel, so it doesn't look so like squatty and tiny. So yeah, let's jump to the next step. I'm going to actually go through this whole sheet and fill in my second sheet, which has my, it's kind of laid out here. It's my cabinet, door size, vertical and horizontal rail, and panel size. So that's what I like to do so that it's easy figuring when I go to cut all my pieces. So I'm going to do that, and I'll meet you at the next step. So have my whole door chart filled out. As you can see there, I went through, I wrote my width, I wrote how many of the vertical rails, horizontal rails, and how many panels. So it's important also, you're probably already going to know this, but say I need 2 doors, one specific size. I'm going to need 4 vertical rails and 4 horizontal rails. So it's always double because obviously you have 2 rails on either side, 2 on the top and bottom for one specific door. So anyways, another thing I recommend doing, like I touched on a little earlier, was that I had some 2-inch rails for my drawers. Now I recommend using a highlighter. I like to use like yellow for 2-inch rails. That way when I'm looking at it, it kind of pops out at me that it's different, so I don't make a mistake there. So what I do, since I have a lot of like the same sizes, similar sizes, stuff like that, what's a little easier for me is I like to write down my whole cutting list on a separate sheet of paper. This just kind of makes it easier so that I'm just looking at how many I need of that. I'm not looking that I need 4 of them at the top of the list, 2 of them down in the middle, and 2 down below. You can miss stuff. Also with this, what I like to do is I like to count how many pieces of each I have, make sure everything adds together, and that it matches my door chart, so that I'm not going to mess up anything. But anyways, so let's cut to it. All of this wood is already planed to 13/16. That is what we typically make our drawers out of, doors out of. A lot of people use like 3/4. It's not wrong. We like to use 13/16 because it's a little bit thicker, a little bit beefier. Now, if you do not have a planer, this isn't that big of a deal because you can, a lot of different places, if you're buying the wood there, you can also buy it planed. Now, it might not be the exact same for like 2 pieces, or if it was done in different stages. Some was done maybe one day, the other was planed 3 weeks later, something like that. Might not be the exact down to the exact thickness, but you can probably get pretty close and you can finish off the differences in the sanding stage. But regardless, ours is 13/16. This has all been planed down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to figure out the best use of materials so that I have very little waste. Now, we've already made our cabinets, as you can probably see them in the background stacked up. What I do after I plane it down is I have a big stack of wood here, and I go through and I pick the absolute best, straightest, most beautiful pieces, and I put them in a pile that is closest to the planer. And that stuff is kind of set aside for doors. The doors are very important that those come out the best. Now, for face frames, I mean, you want good wood for everything in general. For face frames, if they have a slight bow, slight something in it, It's not super critical because I clamp everything down to the table tight, and then I fasten the sides and everything into the face frame. So it kind of can fix some slight bows and stuff like that. But either way, all that said, I definitely want some of the best wood for my door pieces. So now, before we jump to the next step, which we'll get there in the next phase, but what I like to do is figure out the widths. So our pieces are 2 5/8, like I said before. I need about 3 inches to get that 2 5/8. Really need 2 7/8, but let's say 3 inches for easier figuring. So if I measure this piece right here, this piece is about 8 1/2. I can only get 2 rails out of this, which means I'm going to be wasting like 2 1/2 inches. That's pretty wasteful because I won't be able to get a 3rd rail out of that because I need it to be 9 inches. This piece here is 16, which is pretty big. So I could actually get 15 would be 5. That's a lot. This is actually one of the widest pieces I have right now. I am not going to chew that up for doors. That I'd rather save for something else. But you get the idea. If it's a 6-inch wide piece, I can get 2. If the piece is like 5 inches, I wouldn't use it unless I had to, because I am just wasting a ton of wood trying to get 1 rail out of it. That's not really the best use of wood. And then I do the lengths, which usually, this is all rough sawn. Usually I'll cut off at least 1 inch off the ends. So there's usually some stress cracks. Your wood might not have that if you purchased it from like Home Depot or something like that. So that's something that you don't really have to worry about. But I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to start cutting some pieces. Well, I ran out of maple, so I ended up planing the rest of the stack of maple so I could finish roughing in my pieces. All right, now that we have them all roughed in, hopefully you rough them in like a 1/2 inch bigger than you need. I always do that to make sure, because obviously since they are in the rough, they all have rough edges, nothing's gonna be cut square, so on and so forth. So I cut them all about a 1/2 inch bigger. But now that I have them all roughed in, now it's time to rip them all. So hopefully you have a table saw. If not, it's gonna make this very challenging. I think at Home Depot you can buy pieces that are like 1x2 or 1x3, 1x4, something like that. So if you were trying to like not get away without a table saw, you might be able to manage doing that. Not really sure. So here, what we do is we set the table saw up. Obviously, I told you before, our rails are 2 5/8. Now, I set the table saw up for a 1/16 bigger than 2 5/8 because we have our joiner over here that's going to take off that 1/16, making our finished width 2 5/8. So let's set this up for it right now. 2 5/8, and then do 1/16 over. 2 11/16. It makes a great noise when you tighten the fence. Now to me, this isn't super critical because as you will see in one of the next steps, or maybe 2 steps from now, actually maybe a few steps, when we run it through our shapers has a blade that actually cuts the width on all of them to the precise width. So it's not like super critical. I don't want it to be super heavy. I would prefer it not to be super, like, more narrow than it should be. But, so yeah, so if you have a table saw, It's gonna make this a lot easier. Now, if you don't have a joiner, it's not really that necessary. Now, there's a couple things. I have heard that there is a blade. I actually haven't really done research on this, so I could be wrong. But there's a blade that's supposed to cut and pretty much join it at the same time. It's supposed to leave you with a really, really good finished edge. It's probably a little on the pricey side. All these professional blades in the shop are a little pricier. This one's actually just a Diablo ripping blade, so this one's not much. But the blade we use for cutting sheet goods is like a Forester, like $250 blade. And some of the other blades are like that too. But this is just a ripping blade. If you get one that's gonna join it too, it probably will be on the pricier side. But I've also seen a super like backwoods, like hillbilly style where they took the saw blade out and they actually glued a piece of sandpaper to the inside of the blade. Now, I am not going to recommend doing that because I don't know what that's gonna do. But as it goes through, it's supposed to kind of sand it, leave it with a clean edge. I can't, in my right mind, tell you to do that because that could be dangerous, probably is dangerous. So, but that is something definitely an interesting thing I've seen before. So we're gonna go through, we're gonna rip all these pieces 2 5/8. I do have a few pieces that are 2-inch that I kind of put off to the side because I don't wanna accidentally rip those 2 5/8. Those are for our drawers. So we're gonna go through, I clean up the edge first on the joiner, and then I rip it, clean up the edge on that ripped piece, clean the edge on the other piece, and I just go back and forth. So I'm gonna be hopping back and forth between these two machines for a good chunk of time here, getting all my door rails ripped. So let's get to it. The next step in the process, what I do really quick, I'm just gonna show you with a few pieces. I am making like 30 doors or something like that for this kitchen, but what I'm gonna do is I go through the entire stack, each one, and I put them on a flat table. You wanna make sure that your table is dead flat. You don't want anything that's got humps or bows or anything like that into it. This butcher block top is dead flat and straight. So I place each piece down and I check to see if it's bowed. Now, as you look at this piece, it actually has a little movement to it. If it was dead flat, it would not move on the bench. And if it was bowed this way, like it's kind of bowed this way like this, it spins pretty easy like that. Another way to check is flip it like this and you'll be able to see that both sides touch the bench. And in the middle, there's a tiny gap where I can push it down. Now this exact set with each side touching the table and there's a little gap in the middle, this is the top. That's how I'm gonna put every single piece so that they're all together. It's gonna be bowed like this. And that means this is the face. So I put them all face up right now. Let's see. I can push a little there. I can see a little gap. As I push, the gap closes. That's going to be the face. That one has a little bit of it too. This one actually looks pretty much flat, pretty close to. Now, if you have some incredible maple or wood that you're working with, this might not be that critical, but if you do not do this step and you just full out just cut them and shape them, if you have one that's bowed this way and one that's bowed this way, your entire door will be pretty wacko. You're gonna be able to push each corner and the thing's gonna do this. That's gonna be a disaster when you mount the door and then try to get it to match up to the door next to it. It's just, you'll definitely come across some big issues if you do not do this step. Now, another thing I would do is if you had two that are bowed like that, you know, hopefully most of your stuff is straight, but if you do have a few that are bowed like that, I would try to pair it with another one that's bowed the exact same way. Of course, we're making all the bows go the same way, but if you pair it with another one, the whole door itself will have that slight bow, but when you mount the door, it's just gonna be bowed out in the middle a little bit. It's not gonna be that critical. especially if it's a single door and it's not a door that's gonna meet another one. Stuff like that is easier to hide than if your door is completely wacko. So that's what I'm gonna do with each piece. I'm gonna make sure that they're all face up so that when we do square one side and cut them, usually the top, when you cut it, is much cleaner than the bottom. The bottom ends up having some slightly chip outs. I don't have a zero clearance in our saw, but it's not that big of a deal because with the shapers, it's kind of take it away anyways. I just would prefer a very clean cut from the saw to begin with. So I'm gonna go make sure all of these are face up and then we'll cut them. So to recap, we roughed in all of these pieces, we then ripped them all, and then we just made sure that they are all face up and bowed the same direction. This next step, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with this side and I'm gonna go across the table like this, but I'm gonna bring them over here and I'm gonna cut about a 1/4 inch off one side, and then I'm gonna place that side that's gonna be square away from me. That's just the rhythm that I do things. I like everything square that's away. So when I take the piece, I bring it over, put it here, and I know the left side is square, and I'm gonna be cutting the right side. So we're gonna cut about a 1/4 inch, eighth inch off, whatever. I know that all of my pieces are roughed into about, 1/2 inch to 3/4 big anyways, so it's not a big deal. This table is set up awesome for this, cutting them all to length, because I have a stop block here. So after I square one side, I'll measure, make sure, say 22, make sure it's 22 inches. I can tighten this block down and I can zing off 10 pieces at 22 pretty quick without having to measure each and every single one. So that's what I'm gonna do right now. I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna square this whole table, and then we'll go through and we'll cut them. Now I know this side's square. I kind of use my hands to kind of knock off the burrs to those. And then the next step is going to be measuring it exact. So this is kind of a small piece. This isn't going to work out very good, but if it was a longer piece, say it was going to be 22 inches, let's say. Well, let's say 20 inches because this piece is only 21. So I'd mark 20. I try to mark it exact, and then I double check my measurement to make sure. Sometimes your pencil mark might be on the left side of the line, right side of the line, or maybe you need to split your pencil line right in half. So it looks like I need to cut off my whole pencil line, so it needs to be on the left side. What I would do, let's get that set up. Make it right there. Hold it, and then I would tighten my block. Now that's going to allow me to cut a bunch of pieces at that measurement. Now what I would also do is after I cut it, I would remeasure it. There's a chance that it could be like a 30-second long, hopefully it's not too short. But what I would then do, there's like these little magnifying glasses on each side of this thing, and there's a tape measure actually on the table. So I would look at it, take a look at where it is, I would loosen it and move it a tiny bit forward, tighten it, recut it, and make sure that it's good. And then I would cut them all to that size. So let's go through this stack and let's cut them all. So next we have to machine them with these two shapers. So this shaper here is going to do the tongue, and then this is going to do the groove part. So that part right there is the tongue, and then that right there is the groove. Now keep in mind, you might not have access to shapers like this, which is totally fine. There are router bits that will do this. These shapers take cutters like this, which are pretty beefy cutters, and they go for like $500 to $600 for a set of these cutters, and it comes with both. But what might be more logical for you is they make these router bit sets that come with both the tongue and the groove. Now this is the brand right here. This specific set wouldn't be what you need though to make cabinet doors. This was a set that I bought to make a barn door, and it is got a massive gap in the center. This is 1/2 inch, just mainly so I can make a large barn door. It was actually for my house, and I made it so that I could put 1/2 inch material in there for my panel. This is the smaller version. What we do is there's about 5/16 up here, a little bit more. Then there's a 1/4 inch gap. And then there's a little over 3/16 here. And then this right here is also 1/2 inch. So it's 1/2 inch in. So the actual cutout for the groove is 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch. Now, there is, I'll throw a link in the description. I did find a router bit set that I think would work for it. This specific one wouldn't work for it. But yeah, so we're gonna shape these two pieces. Everything that we do gets ran face down. So I don't know if I already said this, but all the pieces I already transferred over. They're all face down already. And we're gonna run them through, keep them face down because it also needs to be face down for this machine so that everything lines up. There's a little discrepancy on the back. You know, if you put it together and one's a little higher than the other, it's on the back. You can sand it out, but you just don't want anything like that to be on the front of the door. So let's machine these pieces. So now we have all of our tongues cut in our pieces. The next step is going to be doing the groove. Like I said before, obviously we're gonna make sure they are all face down. I'm going to run through the pieces that are 2 5/8 wide first because we need to switch out this board with this one for the 2-inch rails. Just the spacer that keeps it closer to the guide here. So let's do that. Let's run all of these through and then we'll be on to the next step. So for this next step, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the horizontal rails, which are the pieces with the tongues, and take these. Now I have little burrs that come on these. I already took them off. I kind of cut them off with a knife and just kind of clean them off. You'll see in the next clip the burrs that I'm talking about. But I take those off, and then I take a piece of sandpaper and I round over this edge, which is the front edge, the back edge, and then I take it and I run it really quick up and down on the inside and up and down on the outside in the groove to take off any burrs through there. And then I also hit this top here really quick too. Just, you can hit it a few times just to make it really smooth. So that's what I do on the horizontal rails, which you'll see in the next clip. But on the vertical rails, you don't want to sand this too much because you could kind of angle it, and that's where these are going to join into, and you don't really want to do that. So I don't really hit this at all. What I just do is I take a piece of sandpaper and I do the same thing I did on those, put it inside the groove, and I run up and down towards the front, up and down towards the back. And that's gonna eliminate any burrs that would look ugly up against the panel that you kind of be able to see. So I run through all these pieces and I do that. So the next step in the process is going to be measuring for our panels. So let's go ahead, let's jump right to throwing this door together. Make sure it's perfect all the way around. Okay, so there's our door. So I've already put all the vertical rails and horizontal rails together in packages so that they are all together. Let me just show you here. You can see where the tongue goes together on there. Now, you can see that there's a tiny bit of a gap there. Now together with both sides combined, it's about a 1/16 of an inch. What this means is the width of my panel is going to be the same as my horizontal rail, because I already know I'm going to have a 1/16 of an inch of play in there when I slide that panel in there. So when I'm measuring my panel, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that it's the same size as these. These are 10 7/8. My panel is going to be 10 7/8. Now my height, since I said before that we groove 1/2 inch in with our machine, I'm going to measure this. It is 16 13/16, okay? I'm going to add an inch because I got 1/2 inch here, 1/2 inch here. So I'm 17 13/16. And then I'm going to deduct a 1/16 to give it some play. That would be 17 3/4. So one trick is if you have like 10 doors that are by the same height, which is 22, you only got to put one together. Once you know it's going to be 17 3/4, you can go ahead and write down all your panel sizes to that height. You only really have to put one vertical together of each size to have the measurements. So now that I have those, I'm going to put that together. Let's see. It's always good to triple check the door size. 15 1/8, 15 1/8, dead on what we need to do. One trick to taking them apart is keep them flat on a bench. You can use a block, and I usually tap it apart. And then try to take it apart kind of like flat on the bench. Now, if you do this and you end up twisting or anything like that, you can end up breaking the tongue off, damaging something. Or if you have the door standing up and the rails on it and it falls, it could break as well. That's definitely happened more than once, and it is very annoying. So now that we have all our panels measured, which I already went through, already measured all the panels, we are going to jump to cutting them so that we can glue them up. The next step in the process is going to be cutting our 1/4 inch material. Now I use 1/4 inch MDF. This is 1/4 inch. This isn't thinner or thicker. That is one thing I would watch out for if you go to Home Depot or anything like that. Sometimes it's like 7/32. It's not actually 1/4 inch. I would take a scrap rail that you have, or maybe it's one of your good rails, just be careful with it. I would go in, and wherever you're buying your material from, I would go ahead and slide it on there and then just make sure that it's going to fit nice and tight. You know, make sure it's not going to rock at all. I'm not going to push this all the way in because it is kind of challenging to get it out because it fits perfect in there. But what it's going to do is it's just going to create a really nice line there between your door rail and your panel. If it's not tight, you're going to have a gap, and it's just not going to come out as good. You'll have to fill it with like primer and paint or caulk, which caulk would not come out very well at all because you want that nice square clean edge in there. So we're going to go ahead and cut all these. One recommendation would be to take your whole sheet that you buy and plan out ahead of time what you're going to cut from where, just so that you're utilizing your whole sheet like the best that you can, so you're just not wasting a bunch. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to do that, we're going to cut our panels, and then the next step is going to be gluing up our doors. So this is the last step in making your physical door before we move on to sanding it. So I like to put the pieces so that the vertical rail is facing towards me. This one, usually it's facing away because when I pick it up and flip it, it goes on. So you're gonna need some glue for this part, a hammer, a little brush. If you don't have any of these silicone brushes, Rockler has some. There's some on Amazon too. But the silicone ones are awesome because you just leave the glue in it, leaned up against something, and then you just pull it out of the glue the next day, and it is easy to take off. A square, really going to want to make sure the doors are square, and then some clamps. So let's jump into this. This is actually a brand new glue bottle, and I have not cut the top off yet. So, excuse me while I cut the top off the glue. Cut that way too big, by the way, but we're gonna make it work. Woo, a lot of glue coming out. So I would definitely not skimp on the glue. One kind of piece of advice I would give you is if you look at the tongue, see the tongue, you see how the tongue ends here and there's nothing on that side of it. I would usually run the glue up through here on the piece that is going to be touching the rails here. And I'll show you a close up to this in a minute, but I would not put glue super close to where the panel's going to be because some glue might ooze out and is kind of annoying if too much oozes out and then dries near your panel. But we'll get to that in a minute. I definitely have a ton of glue oozing out and I have to grab a rag. Definitely just gonna use a, definitely not a good rag. I don't know if good rags exist because it is a rag. At this point, I'm going to pop my panel in here. Remember that our panels are a snug fit. So kind of put them in like that and then kind of push it down in. Now at this point, it would be really handy to have a block to tap on, and usually I have one handy already, but I didn't. Grab a block that you don't really care about. Tap it down. Just gonna protect from hitting the panel because that will definitely disform it. Okay, that seems to be seated pretty good there. Let's glue up the other piece. I have to go really careful with the glue because a ton wants to come out. You can use a lot of different wood glues. I know some people use Tight Bond or whatever it's called from Home Depot. I forget the brand of this glue. We get it from our cabinet supplier, cabinet material supplier. Okay. Pop this in here. Now, typically when I pop these in, I always want the, like where these tongues come out on the ends to be a little bit out because it's easier to tap it in than it is to tap this piece out. Just a little easier that way. Get rid of some of this excess glue. There is a good amount of it. I used a lot more glue there than I typically do, but I like to do it like this since I know that it's sticking out. I like to put it flat on a bench here, and I tap the rail down, and that'll push my bottom down to where it should be. Okay. Rotate it. Let's make sure we're good here. This could use a little bit more. Actually, looks like it needs to go out. This is where it's a little more annoying to do this, but it's possible. I would just definitely use a block. Okay. So now that we're glued up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang the top over the bench, top or the bottom, whatever side it is, and run my square along the vertical piece, and then make sure the top is square. It's looking pretty close. I'm going to check both sides. Now it looks like it is dead square. Now, if it wasn't square, if I put the square on it, and then you could see that there was like a gap on the bottom, say it was like so, like that, which this is pretty dramatic. What I would do is I would take the door on an angle here, and I would tap right here to try to keep squaring the door, and then I put it back down, tap the top and the bottom to make sure that it is tight, and then recheck it to make sure that I'm there. Now, you're definitely going to want to make sure that they are pretty close to being dead square, or else you'll run into issues later on. Now, I keep them face up, and I take my pipe clamps, and I clamp the door on each rail, and I try to make sure that the door is actually tight to the clamp bar. What I do is I put them both on, and I just kind of snug it, set it on the bench, and then I tighten them at the same time. I actually didn't tighten this one enough at first. Tighten them at the same time so that I'm tightening it all down together. This time I'm going to wipe off any extra glue, and I'm going to double check square to make sure, because sometimes what happens is when you do glue it up, depending if a cut wasn't dead square, it's going to force it to that, to whatever that cut was cut at, which might not be a 90-degree angle, and it will force it out of square, and then I would kind of reconfigure it and try to make it so that it is square. Now, we put these aside, we're gonna wait. Honestly, this glue dries pretty quick. I could be sanding these in like 30 minutes if I wanted to. I'm gonna let them sit for at least 45 minutes to an hour. It doesn't matter anyways because I have another like 22 doors to glue up. So I'm not really in any hurry because I have some time. So let's get these all glued up. Now we unclamp the doors. Now we belt sand. I use a Makita 3x21 belt sander. This has brand new paper on it, and I use 120 grit. Now, what I would recommend is on your bench, I do a strip of like 1/2-inch plywood because it's smaller than my door. So my belt isn't gonna be sanding that piece. It's just really just to hold the door so I can sand up against it and it's not gonna go anywhere. I clamped it down. Now, typically I start with the back. What you can do is if you have something that scrapes the glue chunks off, you can do that. Here, since I've wiped them, I really don't have any glue chunks on there. Maybe there'll be a couple, but what I typically do is start on the back of the door and I go what I call cross grain. So if my door is like this, see my vertical rails go top to bottom, my horizontals only go from here to here. So I'm gonna sand this way first on both the top and the bottom, And then I'm gonna sand this way to get some of the scratches that I then put across the grain here out when I sand this way. Now, there'll still be some scratches there. There'll definitely be some, but we will try to work those out in the finish sanding stage. So for right now, we're gonna just belt sand this. So we're gonna go cross grain here. You might not need to sand it that much. I had one here that was a little bit uneven, so I sanded it a little extra. This is the back of the door, so anything like that is completely fine. You can just sand it out. If you've never belt sanded before, be really careful not to stop in one place for too long because you will just start eating away at the wood. Another thing to be careful of is when you're moving back and forth, try not to go too far that you tip. It's really easy to get that back here. Sometimes I still do it, but you can get back here and tilt, and that's instantly gonna add like a angle or a bevel to the back of your door, or the front, which you don't really want. So now that I did both of those, I'm gonna come back through and I'm gonna do the vertical rail. I always like to feel it to make sure that it's all flat and smooth. I do go over the edge where the horizontal and vertical rail meet. I go over that a little bit. I know I'm gonna put some scratches in that, but we're gonna get those out in the finish sanding stage. I'd rather just make sure that that is dead flat there, so when we paint it, you can't see a line. And then you repeat it on the front. Then you have a belt sanded door. Next, we're going to be edge sanding them, and then we have to drill them for the hinges. The next step in the process is edge sanding, well, the edges. So, as you see here, where we glued our pieces together, where we have two pieces joining in, this is the main part that we're focusing on. This is already somewhat kind of smooth from, the joiner. So, and we're also already going to be finish sanding it in the next step, in one of the next steps. So I kind of start with that side there, and I kind of rotate it around like so. But it's not really, if you don't have an edge sander, this isn't that critical. You can, as long as you did a pretty good job in gluing it up, making sure they were pretty close to dead even, you can finish sand that off. The other option would be if you have a hand belt sander, which is pretty important in the previous steps anyways. You could either, I think they make jigs where you can kind of clamp that edge or your belt sander to a table, make it kind of square. You want it square with the table, just like this is square here, or else you're going to mess up the edge of your door. But they might make a jig like that, or you can make one so that you can kind of do your edges that way. Or if you're really good at freehanding it, clamp the door down and you can kind of edge sand it by hand, with the belt sander. But I would say kind of play with a couple ideas. If you have some that are really off, maybe those are the only ones that you belt sand by hand like that. But one thing to note, depending on the material you are using, don't take off too much with the edge sander. Just get it just smooth. Don't try to go crazy. There's a previous story of a buddy of mine who was helping me, and we were using a different material. It was poplar. Since then, we switched over to all maple, but he had a oopsie on one, and it kind of swirled around on him, and he tried to get it off by keep sanding it, and he took off like a solid 1/8 to 3/16 off the door. Well, now the other door doesn't really match it, nor do the doors around it are the same size. So right then and there, try not to take off too much. All we're doing is trying to make it smooth, feel pretty smooth, move on to the next step. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do these, gonna edge sand this whole stack, and then we'll be on to the next step. Now for the next step, what we're gonna do, I typically do this on a bench out there, but just to make this a little simpler for me, I put them together like this. Typically, I'll take a square corner of the bench and I'll square up one door, and then I'll line up this one, same with the bottom of the bench, and just make sure that they're gonna go together square along the bottom and with that even gap through between the doors, which you want about 1/8 of an inch, but for this purpose you can just put them right up against each other, and just to make sure that this and this is going to be relatively square, because you can rotate these doors right now if you wanted to. There's nothing saying that they need to go any certain way. The other thing I would look for is take a look here if you have any chip outs, or if anything doesn't look great with the door. You just want to know what doors they are, because if they're wall cabinet doors, you can put a chip out up, you're not going to see it. Base cabinet, you can put the chip out down, you're not going to see it. Stuff like that, just kind of be aware of. Look around your door, and then what I do is make sure they're face up. Then if I drill this one, I'm going to grab it, flip it like this so I can drill the back of that hinge side. You do not want to drill the face of the door, then you're going to have some issues later on, which would be really annoying, including having to redo the door or cut it out, glue a piece in, and anyways. So to drill out, we're using Blum hinges. Now this is just going to depend on what you're using for a hinge, but for Blum hinges, we use a 35 millimeter Forstner bit. I believe this is called Forstner bit. That's about 1 3/8 inch hole. If you can get the 35 millimeter, I would definitely stick with that, because that'll be more exact. But if you get 1 3/8 inch, I would drill a piece of scrap and then see how the hinge fits first before doing it on your door. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to drill all these, get them ready. After we drill them all, we're going to end up filling these cracks down here and then finish sanding. So let's drill these. So have my face, I'm going to flip it around. Now we have it already set up. We have this lined up so that this mark is where I stop my door. I move it down, stop it at this mark. It's about 3 3/4 from the top of the door down to where I drill these. This is kind of specific for more of an full overlay, but it really can vary. That's not super important. You definitely don't want to be too close if you're going to have a big overhang. If anything, you could be down a little bit, but let's drill these. Now we have our holes, and that's what our hinges will fit into. Next, like I said before, we're gonna fill all these little voids that we have in those tongue and groove. What I like to do is take the air hose. I like to blow all the sawdust out so there's nothing in there to make sure that we have a really good bond with it. Also, what you can do, especially if you've already kind of been looking at the doors as you belt sanded them, edge sanded them, you might have already put some pencil marks, circled some voids and stuff that you need to fill on the faces or the backs. Sometimes where these corners meet here, sometimes it can have like a little void on the bottom or the top, stuff like that. So I would just go through, just make sure you fill everything ahead of time. I like to use this plastic wood. They sell it right at Home Depot. This color is light oak. But yeah, it's literally just called plastic wood. They have a bunch of different colors as well, but we're painting this, so it doesn't really matter what color it is because you're not going to see it anyways. One side note, this was not put back correctly, but there's a reason why it's upside down. This is how you access it. This is the right way the label is. It's because you're supposed to store this upside down. So when you flip it up, tap into it, it's just how you're supposed to store it so it stays fresh the longest. This somebody put upside down like that, and it probably won't last as long. But yeah, so like I said, let's blow all these grooves out, and then I'll just go through. I open it, take a little bit out, close it so that it doesn't dry up. This stuff will harden in like, I don't know, like 30 seconds, but I let it sit for at least, I'd like to let it sit for as long as possible, maybe like 5 minutes, if not longer than that, to make sure it really hardens up. I like to kind of like put a little extra on so I can sand it off dead flat. So let's blow these out. As you see, I lined it all up so they're all just very flat there. Kind of makes it easier to fill when you go to do this. At least for me it does. Hopefully this stuff is still pretty moist. Yeah, goes upside down. I just use a old chisel. That's what we use for the wood fill. Need to come back through and take some of that back off. And this is essentially it. Starts to harden up on your fingers too. Now for the final step is finish sanding. So as you remember when we did the horizontal rails, we sanded these edges. This is the back of the door. We sanded these edges, also this edge here. So that's one less thing we're gonna have to do in this process. But I do use the Festool. It's the ETS EC 125 3EQ, which is an insane amount of numbers and letters all in one version of a sander, but this thing is awesome. It's the 5-inch. I'm using some Serious Grit 220 grit sandpaper. They do make the sandpaper for all the Festool sanders as well. Got it off Amazon, but they have their site. But I really like their paper. I think it's pretty decent. So we're using that. Like I said, 220 grit. What I'm gonna do is I usually do the back of the door first. Focus on this, and I focus on these corners where I have the scratch marks from when I belt sanded it. Because I finished going this way, and so I got some scratches on the horizontal rails, and there's still some scratches here from when I went this way. So since these are being painted, it's not super critical. I like to get 99% if I still can, but if we settle to 80%, it's not gonna be that big of a deal because we have a coat of primer and 2 coats of paint going on it, and you're not gonna see that. But still, for my OCD purposes, I still wanna get as many scratches out as possible. If you were making something like a cherry door or quarter sawn white oak, black walnut, something that was going to be stained and or clear finished where you were going to see the wood. Usually, especially with cherry, when you stain it, it actually increases how you see those scratches. You might not see them very much when it's raw wood, but once you put stain on it, it just pops out at you. So you want to spend a little extra time, especially on the front of the door. So I'm going to go around, I'm going to sand the surface for a little extra period of time to make sure I'm really good. I'll take my piece of hand sandpaper, which you can honestly do this at the beginning too. I'm going to end up sanding a little bit off when I do the surface, but you're going to sand this inside corner. Another thing to note is if you are doing a door that's like cherry or quarter sawn white oak or whatever, I'm really careful not to let this paper touch the panel. In this situation, it would be fine because it's MDF being painted. But if you were to do it on cherry or something like that, you could put scratches onto the panel. And again, you're going to see those once you put stain on it. That's one of the main reasons we do these ahead of time, because the panel grain should be this way anyways. So if I were to touch the panel going this way, I'd be kind of going with the grain of the panel. It might not be seen, it might not do anything. If you go this way and you add them like cross grain, that's gonna look horrible. And it's actually gonna be really hard to get out later on. So that's kind of why we do that. And then I still am really careful not to touch the panel. It's not that big of a deal, but if you have really good sandpaper, you can just kind of put a corner right there and just kind of go up and down. Just need to cut the corner. It doesn't need to be like super rounded. So I'm gonna go around, like I said, do that, cut that with this, and then I'll end up just rounding the edges, sanding the edges, and also the corners. But I'm sure you already are familiar with sanding. You want to pretty much sand every surface, make it smooth, and no sharp corners or edges. So let's do that. Let's get this door sanded. A couple other things to make sure is if you find any other voids or anything that need to be filled, do that again, and then I'll set this door aside, let it sit for at least 5 minutes, grab the next one, start sanding it, and then I'll come back to it just to make sure that fill has time to dry up. But yeah, just look around, make sure there's nothing else. This feels really good. We just sanded it. I wouldn't go up higher than 220. You want that primer to have something to bind to, or bond to. Wow, bond. But this came out really good. Just also, I'd blow it off really good. I wipe it at the same time, and then I kind of wipe it with my hand or a rag or a glove or something like that, because there's some fine dust that kind of stick to it. It doesn't come off with the air hose. So let's blow this off. So that ends up being our mission style door, or Craftsman, whatever you want to call it. They come out really nice. It is a very popular choice right now in a lot of the kitchens we do. So I actually have like another 23 to sand. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, comments, anything like that, just shoot them down in the comments. But please like and subscribe.